Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
We are following the breaking news we got less than an hour ago from Hamas, which says that it has accepted a ceasefire proposal put forward by mediators Qatar and Egypt. Hamas says the head of its Politburo informed Qatar's prime minister and Egypt's minister of intelligence that it agreed to the proposal that was put forward by the two countries. This is according to a statement on the group's Telegram channel. We have yet, though, to hear from Israel as to whether or not they have in turn accepted, or from Qatar or Egypt for that matter. But of course, this follows a phone call that happened earlier today between President Biden and Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, in which they discussed not only the efforts towards a ceasefire, but also questions around Rafah and a potential invasion, which the U.S. has been pushing against. For more now, we go to Michelle Jamrisko, a Bloomberg White House reporter who is joining me here in our Washington, D.C. studio. So Michelle, obviously, we are still awaiting confirmation from any of the other parties that have been involved in these ceasefire talks. What we do know, though, is that the administration has been pushing aggressively for an agreement like this to be reached. Right. Not just President Biden when speaking with Netanyahu earlier today, but Bill Burns, who has been in the region, the director of the CIA, and of course, Secretary of State Antony Blinken was on his 7th trip to the Middle East just last week.
That's right. It's been an all-hands-on-deck approach, even more so in recent days. And we were getting vibes from the White House and others in the administration that things might be moving closer. So we have yet to see with this Hamas news, that adds another layer of uncertainty as to whether that's fits into the fast evolving developments here. But they did talk this morning. That was a multifaceted call, really, as they often are between those two leaders, and a lot of reading in between the lines and what they discussed. But we'll have to see, when it concerns Holocaust Remembrance Day this week, when it concerns the Rafah operation that may or may not move forward, and we're seeing tentative signs of that. The evacuation is certainly happening. And when it concerns humanitarian aid, all these questions, those are certainly the topics that were forefront in this call. But, again, a lot of fast-moving developments here.
Well, on your point of Rafah, when we came in this morning, we thought the conversation would be having is that a ceasefire agreement was potentially even farther away rather than closer, given the stalling out, it seemed, that talks experienced in Cairo over the weekend. And then, to your point, the Israeli military signaling to civilians in Rafah they needed to start moving out of parts of the city, which could have laid the groundwork for that ground operation. What we know that the Biden administration is very against that. They have said as much publicly on many occasions. Is Prime Minister Netanyahu in a position now where if he were not to agree in turn to a ceasefire agreement that Hamas has agreed to, that he would be in serious trouble with this White House? Well,
it's very interesting because there's a lot of diplomatic games that might be at work here as well. And we don't know. I mean, you used the word signaling, which I think is appropriate at this point in time. We do know that the Israeli military has signaled for some evacuation of Rafah, not a full evacuation of those civilians there, but at least in part. And we do know that's moving forward. Now, we don't know how long that would take, what the ground offensive would look like if it does move forward, and what it's connected to, what the purpose is there. But as you mentioned, that does create another wrinkle in Prime Minister Netanyahu's strategy. If Hamas has agreed to this deal, he's going to have to figure out, do you move forward, and do you move forward with the sort of purpose that he originally intended for this sort of operation. But certainly, as you mentioned, not supported by the U.S. in its full form.
Yeah, and I wonder what we'll hear from President Biden about this tomorrow when he is planned to give a big speech. It was announced last week on Holocaust Remembrance Day. It will be tomorrow, Tuesday, on Capitol Hill, after he spoke from the White House last week about what we're seeing on campus protests. How would we expect that the tenor of that speech would change if a ceasefire agreement is actually in place before the president gives that address?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly makes it much more complicated. I mean, this week was already pretty tricky in terms of messaging with the Holocaust Remembrance Day. Of course, the Biden administration has been, at this tricky position to balance a lot lot of different things. They certainly want to hammer home the message that their commitment to Israel's security is ironclad, as they've been saying, and as the president himself has said. And they want to hammer home the message of being fully in support of observing Holocaust Remembrance Day, remembering what it's for, and backing those who are fighting anti-Semitism, as well as what they say is other hate-filled speech, to speak to these other issues, campus protests and everything. But at the same time, they want to make fully clear that, and they have in certain ways, that U.S. policy could change if the Rafah offensive moves forward. So we're going to have to see how these developments affect the tone and tenor, as you say, of the president's speech tomorrow.
But all said, domestically, when considering the domestic layout for President Biden, let alone what this would mean for Palestinian civilians, for the families of hostages, for the hostages themselves, if a ceasefire agreement were to be reached, if this were to be confirmed by Israel, it could potentially alleviate some of the pressure here on President Biden here at home with Arab American Muslim voters, young voters who have been so dissatisfied with the way this administration has approached this conflict.
Yes, that's right. And we do have a word. I mean, there's some other reporting in Axios and others talking about, the possibility of an ammunition shipment being delayed from U.S. to Israel, which would be, if it is true, I mean, that would be a big sign of some sort of change in a long-running policy of continuing to support militarily Israel in its fight against Hamas. And we have, as I mentioned, National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby, among others, has said, if this Rafah operation moves forward, which it looks like in some form it might, then, we will tweak our policy in some way. We don't know what that looks like, and maybe this is part of it. But, again, a lot of moving parts, and we see the ceasefire deal maybe on, maybe off, but that it also has an influence here in terms of both the diplomatic side as well as the military side. All
right, Bloomberg's Michelle Jamrisko, who covers the White House for us. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, what we're dealing with here is Hamas, which says that it has accepted the ceasefire agreement put forward by Egypt and Qatar. We have not yet heard word from Israel on this matter. So, of course, we'll keep you updated if and when we do. But we turn now to another expert on this region. Aaron David Miller, I'm pleased to say, is joining us. He is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. It's always great to have you here on Bloomberg Television and Radio. Aaron, obviously, we are still awaiting confirmation from Israel that this ceasefire agreement has been reached. Would it surprise you if it had, considering the rhetoric, the developments that we had gotten out of this region just in the last 48 hours?
Not really. I guess it's a question of urgency. I think as of this morning, I concluded that there is insufficient urgency on the part of Hamas and the Israelis to sign anything. And the urgency that really existed was only on the part of the Biden administration, understandably. I mean, I think we have to be very sober here, though. Number one, we have to wait for an Israeli response. And number two, the quote-unquote proposal, the ceasefire agreement, has been reported in many places in many different forms. I would suspect that if in fact Hamas has agreed to anything and expects the Israelis to agree, it would be to a phase one. That is to say, the exchange of 33 women, the elderly and the infirm, in exchange for an asymmetrical number of Palestinian prisoners, as much as 700 or 1,000, 100 of whom have been accused of or convicted of killing Israelis, and a 40-day, that was the number mentioned in one of the reports, a 40-day temporary ceasefire. What had blocked the negotiations so far is that the Israelis, one of the issues, Israelis had not accepted Hamas's demand that this phase one basically produce a comprehensive ceasefire and withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza, essentially an end to the war. So it's not clear to me whether or not Hamas has accepted, when they say they've accepted the Egyptian Qatari proposal, is this the broader proposal for 3 phases to actually end the war? Or is it phase one, which is the more limited exchange? So I think the good news here is that it could preempt any sort of a significant Israeli ground campaign. It would result in freedom for the hostages, women in particular, who are being abused, and a temporary ceasefire, cessation of hostilities, along with the redeployment of Israeli forces from certain areas of Gaza, and an end to Israeli overflights during the hours where this hostage exchange for prisoners is going to take place. And remember, I would bet that it will be a few weeks, maybe not that long, before implementation of phase one could take place, given the complexity that surrounded you remember the initial exchange of 102 hostages for 400 Palestinian prisoners in mid-November. So a lot we don't know. And, there's also the dead cat on your doorstep theory, which is that Hamas has accepted trying to put the ball in Israel's court and now leaving Benjamin Netanyahu with the decision whether to agree or not. The president's phone call this morning, clearly they discussed this issue. And since Bill Burns is in Doha, in Qatar, CIA director, I think this is probably more real than not real.
Okay, and to your point, there are still a lot of details we don't know. The statement that we got from Hamas did not provide further details on what exactly this deal would look like, what it all entails, and we still have not gotten word from Israel. But Aaron, it's worth kind of going back to that point you were just making about now it kind of does put the ball in Bibi Netanyahu's court. If Hamas says, okay, we agree, what kind of position is he in if he does not do so in return, not just geopolitically in terms of the consequence he could face from a Biden administration that might be very unhappy with that decision, but also domestically, knowing the great deal of pressure that he is under at home?
Yeah, well, I think, to quote the president, here's the deal. Secretary of State Blinken described the Israeli proposal last week as, quote, extremely generous, unquote, thereby, I think, locking the administration in to whatever the prime minister was prepared to agree to that over the last 10 days Hamas had rejected. So if, in fact, Hamas's agreement puts on the table new conditions and they expect the Americans to press the Israelis hard, the Biden administration is going to have a tougher time having praised Netanyahu's initial offer. So this is what I mean by the sort of diplomatic gamesmanship, one-upsmanship that's circulating here. But I suspect, given the fact that the president had a conversation with the prime minister in the last, several hours, the fact that CIA Director Burns has been in Cairo and Doha managing all of this, he knows what's in that deal. And I suspect he'll be able to give the administration a pretty accurate read as to what to expect from the Israelis. I wouldn't imagine under these circumstances, if Hamas's acceptance is real and if it applies to what the Israelis had agreed to, then I think chances are you'll see us move to the next phase, which will be the preparation for implementation of phase one. On the other hand, if Hamas has put stuff on the table and the administration thinks it's reasonable and realistic, and Netanyahu had not agreed, then you may see some friction.
Yeah, well, it's worth pointing out that in the statement that Hamas posted on Telegram, they said they were accepting a proposal put forward by the two countries of Qatar and Egypt, not Israel. So I wonder if there is maybe a difference in what the administration was talking about versus what Hamas says it's agreeing to today. Again, we're still awaiting details. Just finally, Aaron, given that you were suggesting that this may take weeks to actually implement, is there still a chance in your mind in our final minute with you that Israel could move into Rafah in the interim? As they have already signaled to civilians there, they should begin moving out?
No. If in fact Hamas has accepted a credible proposal that's within the Israeli ballpark, I think the odds that the Israelis will move into Rafah under those circumstances, to jettison a deal on which the administration has banked almost everything. Kirby admitted the other day there's no plan B. President wants to change the pictures in Gaza, free the hostages, surge humanitarian assistance, and try to manage the domestic political fallout from accusations that he's mismanaged this war, unhappy with progressives, and the Israelis jettison that. Well, I think you can draw your own conclusions what might happen as a consequence.
All right. It's Aaron, it's always great to have you on Balance of Power, but especially on a day like today with this developing news. Thank you so much for joining us. Aaron David Miller, of course, is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And I would remind our listeners and viewers, what we have right now is a statement from Hamas that it has accepted a ceasefire proposal put forward by Qatar and Egypt. We have not yet heard from either of those two countries, nor have we heard from Israel as to whether it has accepted this agreement in turn. So we will continue to keep you apprised here on Bloomberg Television and radio, and we'll have much more coming up in just a few minutes. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
We are dealing with some breaking news. Hamas has said that it is accepting a ceasefire proposal that has been put forward by mediators Qatar and Egypt. This is according to a statement that was put on the group's Telegram channel. We have not yet, though, heard firm word from Israel. Channel 12 now reporting, according to a headline crossing the Bloomberg terminal, that Israel is studying this updated ceasefire proposal. Remember, Hamas has said here it accepted a proposal put forward by two other countries, Qatar and Egypt, not necessarily the same as the Israeli proposal that we heard about from the Biden administration last week when Secretary of State Antony Blinken called Israel's proposal generous. We do not have details on what exactly this all may entail, and again, no confirmation yet from the other parties involved. We want to turn now to Jeanne Zaino, Bloomberg Politics contributor, and Chapin, a Republican strategist and managing director at Actum. Thank you both for being here. Jeanne, while we wait for firm confirmation of this news, of course, it does have great political weight on President Biden domestically, especially ahead of a speech on anti-Semitism he is set to give tomorrow on Holocaust Remembrance Day. What do you just make of the timing of all of this news colliding simultaneously ahead of a big address like that on the day that Columbia University announced its main commencement ceremony is not happening because of protests there? It is a very complex picture, both at home and abroad.
Yeah, I mean, it is fascinating because we're less than 24 hours away from the president's speech for Holocaust Remembrance Day. And the idea that we could also be within sight, perhaps, as you keep talking about, of a ceasefire, temporary, I would assume, maybe permanent, might change the trajectory of what the president has to say tomorrow. So very, very tough for the White House to manage all of this. But I do think that the best case scenario, not just for Joe Biden politically, but more importantly, for everybody involved, including and especially the hostages there, would be a ceasefire. But I think we have to be very, very cautious on all of this because we still haven't gotten confirmation. And of course, we know Israel was on the brink of moving into Rafah. And of course, if Hamas put any conditions on this, I think that could blow the entire thing up. So I think we have a lot more questions here, and that does make the White House's job a little more difficult as they're looking at this big speech tomorrow for the president.
Well, another headline just crossing the Bloomberg terminal. The president of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, says that Turkey welcomes Hamas's move to accept the ceasefire. Again, though, that's from Turkey, not from Qatar, Egypt, or Israel, the three countries that we are awaiting a firm word from. Chapin, just to bring you in here, of course, this is happening roughly 7 months into the war between Israel and Hamas, and now less than 6 months ahead of an election in November. To what extent do you expect this issue, what is happening in the Middle East, the conduct and approach to the relationship with Israel is going to factor into who ultimately wins the presidency come November?
Well, I would qualify this with 6 months in politics as sort of a lifetime. And with the way that things move so rapidly in today's day and age, I think there is a chance that this is in everyone's, there is a chance that this is in everyone, at least in American politics review. Some people in American politics review window. Of course, it will not be for the people going through it in the Middle East. So I do think there will be a lessening of it. I think now is probably in retrospect, might be a huge inflection point, right? The president's going to give his speech. There are talks of ceasefires. So it is, like Jeanne said, it does put him in a harder position as he's trying to give this speech and navigate the internal domestic politics. But it's a great opportunity for him to get out there, talk about the anti-Semitism problem that's happening across the country. He'll be able to, as presidents usually do, scold Israel a little bit. show some support for the Palestinian people, and see if he can sort of thread that very careful needle on his side of the aisle, which in my view is a little bit fractured on, support for Israel or the Palestinians or Gaza or whatever is happening on college campuses these days. So I do think it's all colored by that. And I do think he has a huge opportunity. And of course, it will be under the shadow of whether there is actually a ceasefire or not. It would be great for the president to be able to stand up there after a ceasefire, at least in principle, or at least has been announced that they're close to one. That would be, I think, a good backdrop for his speech to sort of head out of this and into the summer months when economy, gas prices, inflation, as people leave college campuses, right, and go home. Students go home, that will wane right in time to convene 2 months before the election again after the end of the summer. But we'll see what the state of the world is at that point.
Yeah, well, time is a weird thing in politics, Chapin. Your point is very well taken. 6 months is basically a lifetime. So I will say what I'm about to say with that caveat that there's only so much polls can tell you, surely 6 months out. But I do want to point out a few polls that we've gotten over the weekend, one being ABC and Ipsos doing some polling on the general election contest between President Biden and former President Trump. Basically shows they're locked in a tight race. We all know that. Excluding people who say they wouldn't vote, Trump is winning 46-44. When you narrow it, though, to registered voters and then likely voters, Biden 49, Trump 45. So once you get to those who are actually likely to turn out at the ballot box, Jeanne, Biden is ahead. Does that just underscore that all of this is ultimately going to be, at the end of the day, about turnout?
It will. And of course, I'm so glad you mentioned the screening. That's critically important. You need to look at likely voters to get a really good sense. But of course, the other issue here is we're talking national polls versus Bloomberg's poll, which is the critical states that we look at. And those key states are going to decide this election. So the national polls are obviously fascinating. I love to look at them. But the real question of a winner and a loser here is going to come on those states, those 7 critical states. Although Trump's team wants to add Minnesota and Virginia, we understand over the weekend, I don't know that they deserve to be there. That's the other complication here. But the poll was fascinating because it did show, obviously, it is a neck and neck race. And Joe Biden's challenges remain in the demographics. Young people, African Americans, that is a critical challenge for him. This has to be a referendum on Donald Trump for him to win, and vice versa for for Donald Trump to win. It has to be a referendum on Joe Biden. They are both incredibly unpopular.
Well, Jeanne, teeing me up perfectly for the next question I wanted to ask Chapin, which is, are we only really talking about 7 swing states, or should we be talking about 9? Trump's team says their polling suggests that Minnesota and Virginia are in play. Chapin, you buy it?
Sure, I'll buy it. Like you said, it's 6 months out. Maybe this game and the map will change, expand, and shrink on both sides. I'd love to see a time lapse of internal strategies, electoral maps in each campaign office, and see how they move and shift over the days. I do think there will be some wild cards, as always. A state like Virginia may pop at the end for Trump. 6 months from now, who knows? The point everything you guys have said so far, I think is true. I think the electorate is shrinking. And what I mean by that is the persuadables, right? I think Axios this morning or last night had an article about how both campaigns are saying the persuadables in these 7 swing states, or however many you want to call it, is all less than 10%. So they're fighting for not only these few states, they're fighting for less than 10% in each of these states as persuadable voters. So to sort of circle back, it is going to be incredibly important for their bases to be energized and out and voting in full force to sort of, counteract the referendum on each particular candidate, which this is turning out to be. And no one should be surprised by this because, Donald Trump and Joe Biden's name recognition, nobody I don't think anyone in this election is going to say I have to read more about each candidate and figure out who I'm voting for, right? That's less than 10% that we're talking about. Everyone else knows these people and has an opinion already, which is the difficulty. Then you have to get those people to vote.
Yeah, very true. And when talking about the demographics and the makeup of the Democratic base, specifically, Jeanne, some other polling I wanted to point to, Washington Post and Ipsos, a poll of more than 1,300 Black adults, finds only 62% of them say they're absolutely certain to vote. That is down 12 points from the 74% who said so in 2020. And the drop in turnout interest is sharpest among younger Black people. How is the Biden campaign likely to look at this polling, Jeanne?
Yeah, this is devastating for the Biden team. They've got a money and time advantage right now. If anything lights a fire under them, it should be those numbers you just read. Joe Biden got 84% of African Americans in 2020. He had them by big numbers, African Americans, younger African Americans in 2020. To lose that is devastating for the campaign. So they've got to use the time and the money they have while Donald Trump is in court with this fundraising advantage to appeal to that demographic in these swing. And I don't care if we call them 7 or 9 states, they've got to go on the air and they've got to talk about what a Donald Trump presidency means for these people. They've got to remind people the impact on healthcare, the impact on reproduction, the impact on the Supreme Court, the impact on freedom and liberty, all of those things that Joe Biden can, look at these polls and say people give him a slight advantage, including in the ABC poll in terms of character. That's the only way they can do it. And it's going to be an uphill battle. These are really difficult numbers with the African American and young community.
Yeah, another figure from this poll, nearly 1 in 5 Black voters who turned out for Biden in 2020 say they are less than certain about whether they will vote at all this year. Jeanne, Zaino, Bloomberg Politics contributor, and Chapin, Actum managing director and Republican strategist. Our political panel today. Thank you so much for joining me.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio, where, of course, we're keeping an eye on all of the happenings here in Washington, but we also have to keep an eye on what's happening in New York today, as it's a new week in Donald Trump's criminal hush money trial. The proceedings kicking off today with him being found in contempt of court again for another instance of violating the gag order that he has been placed under in this case, and fined another $1,000 for that violation. It brings the total fines up to $10,000 after he was charged with 9 different counts of that, found in contempt of court for 9 different instances last week. The thing is, he's a billionaire, at least on paper, and the judge seems to recognize that. He said today in court, when handing down this order, that he fears that $1,000 fines are not acting as a deterrent. And he threatened to actually put the former president in jail, although he did emphasize that he is reluctant to do so, might be a last resort, as there are a number of complicating factors that would be involved in that, including the fact that as former president, he is entitled to Secret Service protection, would make the whole thing very logistically complicated. So we want to get more now with Josh Naftalis. He is a partner at Palace Partners, also a former federal prosecutor, was the assistant attorney at the Southern District of New York. Thank you so much for being here on Balance of Power, Josh. How likely is it in your mind that Donald Trump may actually end up spending some time in jail for violating this gag order?
Thanks for having me. As you said, the judge is trying to avoid that at all costs, which makes sense. I mean, he doesn't want to disrupt the trial, and obviously logistically, it's a nightmare for the Secret Service. So I think the judge is keeping it out there as an option, but we're not there yet, obviously.
Well, when you say it would disrupt the trial, can you just shed some light as to what realistically we're talking about? It was pointed out to me earlier today by one of our legal editors here at Bloomberg that it's a frequent occurrence that a defendant is brought in from jail to attend court trial proceedings. How disruptive would it be? Would it just be it lengthens the time of the trial? Would it have to be put on pause for some period of time? What realistically are we talking about?
I think both of those issues are potential complications. It could delay the trial because I would imagine the Secret Service would have to adjust and set up a protocol to bringing Mr. Trump to and from court and how he would be held overnight. That's just, Secret Service 101. There's also then the delay that would impact the trial and the worry of telling the jurors potentially that the president had been remanded into custody. And then there's also the appellate issues that this creates. I imagine Donald Trump and his lawyers would argue this is interfering with his defense, that he's no longer able to properly prepare. So all of these delays, again, as a government prosecutor, you don't want delays in your trial. You want the evidence to come in and get to the verdict. You don't want to risk losing your juror or have appellate issues get raised.
Fair enough. And of course, it is the aim of protecting not just potential witnesses or likely witnesses in the case, but also members of the jury that this gag order is designed for, right? Can you just speak to why this is so important that a judge might actually be willing, if not super reluctantly, to throw a former president in jail because of it? Why is this so consequential that incarceration could be justified?
Sure. So, it's the judge's courtroom. He sets the rules. And what Mr. Trump is doing is he's flouting those rules, including to try to intimidate witnesses or get his narrative out there such that maybe jurors would learn about it. But in the end, it's the idea that he deserves a fair trial, but so does the government. He's not allowed to speak outside of the walls of the courtroom and try to get things in front of the jury or just at large to disrupt the witnesses. And that's just how trials are run.
Fair enough. And of course, trials are also run with witnesses taking the stand and giving testimony, which we are continuing to see today. Today was not just about a gag order violation. Of the actual testimony we've heard so far from everyone from a former White House aide, Hope Hicks, to David Pecker, formerly of the National Enquirer, what has been the most compelling so far in terms of the actual substance of the accusations here and the question that the jury is considering?
That's a good question. I think it's all a mosaic as to what's the most important. The government's trying to put in each little piece, whether it's Hope Hicks and the drama of it, whether it's when we get to Michael Cohen and specifically what was said, whether it's Pecker and how the business worked. I'm not sure which is the most dramatic. Hope Hicks obviously sounds like it's been the most dramatic. I haven't been in the courtroom. But each piece in the end is important to the government because they're going to pull it all together and say to the jury, listen, this shows that he's guilty. It's not just one day they got him. It's all the evidence that comes in over a number of weeks.
Yeah, fair enough. And it is worth keeping in mind that there is kind of multiple things that the prosecutors are trying to prove here. One, that he falsified business records by misclassifying as legal costs, essentially repayments to Michael Cohen over the actual hush money itself. And then the other part of this being that there were political incentives here, that this was done with the effort to influence the outcome of the 2016 election. So we've heard a lot of substance on the business side in terms of the actual documentation, where money was moving, who was moving it, kind of how all of this logistically worked. Perhaps the more boring testimony, perhaps, that we could hear. We have yet to hear some of the more salacious testimony that we could hear, including from Stormy Daniels, the porn star herself, who is in question in this case, or Karen McDougal, for that matter, a former Playboy model. Will that be mostly just it gets the headlines, it gets the attention of the jury, it's the human interest kind of part of the story that kind of factors into this case? Or could their testimony bring real substance that informs whether or not the jury convicts him of these charges?
Oh, I think there's definitely substance to what their testimony will be, including because the evidence is going to be, why did they agree to take the money? What happened with Mr. Trump? What was his motive? And in the end, what the issue is for the jury, and I think the government's going to argue, is, did Mr. Trump intend to commit these crimes? And when you hear the testimony of the two women, if you hear it from Michael Cohen as to what Mr. Trump was saying, that's how they're going to be able to put the pieces together and say, it's not just him signing checks. He knew exactly what he was doing was wrong.
Well, on the subject of Michael Cohen, I'm glad you brought him up. Obviously, one of the instances, or several of them, in which Trump has been found in violation of this gag order was attacking him, calling him things like a sleazebag, for example. Clearly, the defense is trying to paint him a picture of him as being an untrustworthy witness because he has, in fact, spent time in prison and lied and all of these things. All of that is matter of fact. Michael Cohen, of course, maintains that he did so in protecting Donald Trump, so everything should be viewed with that lens. But does that make him a credible or a compromised witness in your mind, Josh?
So Mr. Cohen's is obviously a difficult witness, but I don't think he brings that much more baggage to the table than the average cooperating witness, which is most cooperating witnesses are being called because they were involved in the scheme itself. There's an old saying that prosecutors use, which is you don't call priests and rabbis to testify as to what happened, because those aren't the type of people that commit the crimes of the defendant. You call the co-conspirators. So obviously Mr. Cohen brings a lot of baggage to the table, but that's sort of the point. That's the kind of person you ask to commit a crime for you and with you. And I think the government's going to be able to weaponize that as much as Mr. Trump is afraid of him.
Fair enough. And final question for you, Josh, as we watch the remainder of this week of the trial unfold, potentially we have several more weeks to go. How important is it, just the idea that the defense could sow doubt in the mind of even just a single juror, enough to make sure that a conviction does not happen, rather than trying to disprove whether or not these payments were actually made or anything like that, the actual, evidence of the case, where the money was going and how it was classified? Is it just about casting enough of a shadow over this idea that this really was intended to change the outcome of 2016?
So I think the strategy that his lawyers, Todd and Emil and Susan, are going to go after is trying to find that one juror and sow the doubt. They don't need to prove to 12 people that Mr. Trump is innocent, not guilty. They need to find one person who just can't do it, whether that's because they don't want to do it, because they don't think the facts support it, whatever the reason is. They're just trying to get the lowest common denominator level of proof in front of one juror such that the jury hangs. I think that's his best option. I mean, the idea that 12 people would find him not guilty is unlikely. It almost never happens in a criminal case, but particularly one like this, where the evidence is pretty straightforward. The question is, did he intend to do it?
All right, Josh Naftalis, great to have you back here on Bloomberg Television and Radio, former federal prosecutor and partner at Palace Partners. We appreciate your time today. Now, I do just want to quickly update you on some breaking news we have been following throughout this hour. Hamas, of course, had said in a statement that it had accepted a ceasefire deal proposed by Egypt and Qatar. We now do have confirmation from the U.S. State Department that Hamas has issued a ceasefire response. This is according to spokesperson Matt Miller. He says the U.S. is now reviewing that response from Hamas with regional partners. Again, we have not yet heard firmly from Israel whether or not they too are going to accept the proposal in question. We will bring you more details on Bloomberg Television and Radio as we have them. We also want to get you an update on what's happening on Capitol Hill as Congress, or at least the House, is back in Washington today. The Senate isn't going to be back until tomorrow, but there is a big deadline looming at the end of this week. The FAA reauthorization needs to happen by May 10th. The question is, will it? Jack Fitzpatrick covers Congress for Bloomberg Government, and he is joining me now from Capitol Hill. So, Jack, obviously we're working under a deadline here, and yet the Senate isn't even in today. Is this going to happen in time, or are we looking at another short-term extension?
It's a real gamble at this point. They have said, Senator Schumer has said he does not want another short-term extension. The key question is, can they negotiate a unanimous consent agreement to hold a quick vote in the Senate, which is contingent on allowing amendments that members want. That's usually the demand from a variety of members, that they want an amendment on this piece of legislation that they like, or this tweak to the bill. That is still being negotiated. It is not easy to get unanimous consent in the Senate, but we know that if they don't get that via an agreement on a package of amendment votes, likely amendments that would fail so that they don't change the underlying bill, but at least give votes, then they're not going to make the Friday deadline and they would be forced to rely on a short-term extension. So that's what's being negotiated now. It is dicey when you bring in tough major pieces of legislation and say, I want an amendment on that. For example, the tax bill that the House passed, that Senator Wyden has pushed to attach to this FAA bill, that is a tough one because this is a carefully negotiated package, so making major changes would also cause a holdup potentially, but they're still negotiating those amendment votes and trying to get it done by the end of this week.
Yeah, I guess when it says it's been described the last train to leave the station, everybody's going to try and get as much baggage on that train as humanly possible. So we'll be watching for that in the Senate this week, Jack. Meantime, in the House, we also are on watch to see if Marjorie Taylor Greene, the congresswoman from Georgia, does as she was promised to do and actually force a vote on her motion to vacate against House Speaker Mike Johnson. Do we have any indication of when that might actually happen?
It could be as soon as today. She is supposed to meet with the speaker today, according to some of my colleagues. The Congresswoman has not backed down at all from her claim that she will force a vote. She was tweeting earlier that she's being threatened with losing her committee assignments. So there is no détente, there is no easing of tensions there. We don't know about the exact timing, but it could be as soon as today. There is a plan to vote to table it, which is a little easier for Democrats to vote to do away with the motion rather than casting a vote for Mike Johnson as Speaker. But as for the timing, it really is up to Marjorie Taylor Greene as to when she pulls the trigger on this and makes it happen. And she has not divulged exactly when that's going to happen, other than saying that she is going to do it.
Yeah, so we'll be watching for updates from that meeting, which is supposed to be later this afternoon. Jack, just quickly in our final minute with you, it's also worth pointing out that a Democratic Congressman, Henry Cuellar of Texas, was indicted by the DOJ. We learned this on Friday, accused of accepting $600,000 in bribes. Are we going to see an effort to oust him like we saw when former Congressman George Santos was kicked out of the body before he was actually found guilty in a court of law?
That is possible. We haven't gotten to that point just yet because this just broke on late on Friday. He did have to step down from a committee leadership role. These are serious charges. Some of them carry sentences of up to 20 years, so it's not something that members are overlooking. It's certainly something to keep an eye on to see if, especially starting with Republicans, push for him to resign. That is a possibility.
Well, we know you will have your eye on that for us, as you have your eye on so many things on Capitol Hill. Jack Fitzpatrick, congressional reporter for Bloomberg Government, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.